Hello, my name is Erin, and today I will be discussing Indigenous environmental management. Specifically, I will be discussing the issues that need to be overcome in order to authentically engage Indigenous peoples in environmental decision making and implementation. Throughout this presentation, I will be focusing on Indigenous environmental management in Australia. Before I begin my presentation, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land. I pay my respects to all elders past, present and emerging. I also extend this respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are listening to this presentation today. It is well known that decision making in environmental management is difficult at best. Understandably, this difficulty arises primarily as a consequence of the complexity of environmental issues. This difficulty is compounded by the controversy surrounding what type of knowledge is required to make informed and effective environmental decisions. The most widely valued type of knowledge in the field of environmental management is expert scientific knowledge. However, there is increasing debate as to whether or not this knowledge is effectively addressing the complex environmental issues we are currently facing. It is argued that effective management of these issues requires more than just expert scientific knowledge. As a consequence, there has been a shift in environmental management approaches towards Indigenous ecological knowledge. This shift recognises the strengths of Indigenous ecological knowledge and the limitations of expert scientific knowledge. Efforts are increasingly being made to incorporate Indigenous ecological knowledge into environmental management. So what is Indigenous ecological knowledge? It is a subset of traditional knowledge and it is derived from experience or observation. Specifically, it is detailed knowledge of all aspects of the environment, which has been developed over thousands of years. Indigenous peoples may pass this ecological knowledge on through oral or written communications. In Australia, there is increasing recognition of the value of Indigenous ecological knowledge. As Howard explains, many have found valuable ideas, guidance and wisdom in the traditional values, knowledge and epistemologies of Indigenous peoples. It is thought that this Indigenous ecological knowledge may address the increasingly complex environmental issues we are facing. For instance, Indigenous ecological knowledge is considered to be critical for sustainability. Lynch, Ross and Carter argue that this is because Indigenous people have showed a remarkable capacity to adapt to changes in local resources and their variability, and to harness and manage them. It is evident that the ecological benefits of engaging Indigenous people in environmental management are immense. However, there may also be significant social and cultural benefits. For instance, authentic engagement could also improve reconciliation, living standards, and governance for many Indigenous peoples in Australia. There are many ways in which Indigenous people participate in environmental management in Australia, for example, native title agreements. That said, the most successful examples of authentic engagement with Indigenous peoples in decision making and implementation are in the Northern Territory. One such example is that of the wetland burning in Kakadu National Park. Bobby Plain Wetland in Kakadu National Park is a highly important ecosystem which provides habitat to a diverse range of species. However, as can be seen in this photograph, in recent years this wetland has been overtaken by native grass. Consequently, this has reduced habitat and limited access for both hunting and food gathering. In response, the CSIRO and the Bushfire Cooperative Research Centre relied on Indigenous ecological knowledge to prevent further impacts to the wetland. These organisations consulted with a family of traditional owners in Kakadu National Park to implement traditional fire management techniques. In short, a pattern of repeated burning was carried out to reduce the native grass. Over time, these traditional fire management techniques proved highly effective at managing the native grasses in the wetland. As can be seen in this photograph, the repeated burning led to an increase in biodiversity and, in turn, demonstrated the value of Indigenous ecological knowledge in the management process. Over time, these traditional fire management techniques proved highly effective at managing the native grasses in the wetland. As can be seen in this photograph, the repeated burning led to an increase in biodiversity and, in turn, demonstrated the value of Indigenous ecological knowledge. Despite the increasing recognition of Indigenous ecological knowledge, there are still some issues which prevent authentic engagement with Indigenous peoples in environmental management. These issues stem from the historical and social processes of removal and marginalisation, which have significantly impacted Indigenous peoples in Australia. The inability of Indigenous people to engage in environmental management is limited by the requirement to prove their connection to the land which is being managed. Without this connection, Indigenous people are unable to assert their rights and interests over land and thus cannot participate authentically in the management process. Since Indigenous ecological knowledge differs in the way that it is obtained and communicated from expert scientific knowledge, it is often dismissed by experts in the field of environmental management. Specifically, there are many who regard Indigenous ecological knowledge as unreliable and lacking rigour. Understandably, this dismissal is detrimental to Indigenous people. This issue is further compounded by the fact that Indigenous peoples have differing views in regards to environmental management issues. As Brown argues, those involved have their own set of priorities, sources of evidence, and ways of testing it, all adding up to distinctive ways of constructing knowledge. Subsequently, these differences often lead to disagreements in decision-making and implementation. Perhaps the most crucial issue preventing the engagement of Indigenous peoples in environmental management is the concern that their ecological knowledge may be misused. That is, there is a concern that Indigenous ecological knowledge could be appropriated and, in turn, used to benefit those who are not Indigenous. In all, despite the increasing recognition of the value of Indigenous ecological knowledge and the important role that Indigenous peoples have in the environmental management process, there are many issues which still prevent their authentic engagement in decision-making and implementation. Evidently, there must be efforts made to overcome these issues. In conclusion, it is crucial that Indigenous ecological knowledge is recognised and implemented considerately in environmental management processes. Crucially, this will allow Indigenous peoples to authentically engage in environmental decision-making and implementation. Thank you for listening to my presentation.